Well, good afternoon slash evening, depending upon however you identify that. I'm grateful to have all of you here today, as well as for panelists. Today we'll be together about an hour, and we have developed some questions that we hope will be informative and reflective of some of the current issues and concerns and needs for the Black mental health, our mental health of Black community, as well as incoming and potential new members of counseling or related professions entering into graduate studies. And so today I'll begin by introducing our panelists. One panelist will be joining us just a few minutes late. We'll have about 45 minutes of questions. We'll make sure to safeguard some time for you to ask questions to the panelists. We'll close with some just general remarks about kind of a brief call to action, and then we will wrap up for today. So I will introduce all of our panelists, and if there's anything else that a panelist would like to add or expand upon, please feel free to do so. So first we have the wonderful and brilliant Dr. Delisha M. Pittman. She's an associate professor and award-winning board certified psychologist and licensed professional counselor. She's the first African-American to be board certified in counseling psychology in the District of Columbia. Dr. Pittman's research centers on mental health, behavior, and health outcomes in Black emerging adults. Most recently, her work is examining the sexual health, behavior, and related disparities among young Black women. So it's great to have you today, Dr. Pittman.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to see you all. Thanks for being here. I'm excited for this conversation with you.
Next, we have Dr. Sultan Magruder. He will be joining us a few minutes late as he is in session, but he will certainly be here. He is a staff psychologist and diversity, equity, and inclusion program coordinator for the counseling and psychological services at Penn State University. So we're looking forward to him joining us. Next, we have Chris Gamble. He is a clinical mental health counseling alumnus and licensed professional counselor who currently serves as a family advocate in the Family Advocacy Services program at Safe Shores in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and excited to be with everyone on the panel.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And last but not least, we have Shani Banks, a current master's student in the clinical mental health counseling program, focusing on the intersections between race, spirituality, and mental health.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a list of questions that we'll be kind of using to guide today's conversation. The first conversation is for those in particular who are interested in pursuing a mental health or counseling program of study in the near future. So what advice do you have for Black students looking into or applying to graduate programs in counseling and related mental health professions?
Shani and Chris, do you want to start?
I can start. It has been a long time since I applied to grad school, but I would say my my recommendations for anybody interested, particularly in counseling or any mental health field, for one, well, I guess just in general, for any higher education, just be aware of any scholarships out there. We all know how expensive school is, so that's kind of a blanket piece of advice. But for counseling, I would say it's fun, it's challenging. So really pay attention to the kind of supports that the school has for the students, so that as you are preparing to become a counselor, you have your own supports as you are learning how to support others.
Yeah, I would add on to that and just say that I feel like there's kind of an introspective preparation that goes into it. At least there was for me. And that work was really important. And that was just kind of knowing what my goal was coming into the profession. So I say knowing what your goal is, who do you want to serve? Why do you want to serve? And then like what uniquely are you bringing to the profession? Because one thing that I found that I really love about the counseling profession is actually how malleable it is. So obviously, while there are like ethical and theoretical guidelines for how you work, I feel like there's also a lot of room to kind of forge new roads. So you can recognize a need and fill that need. So for example, I'm really interested in spiritually conscious, like dance movement therapy for women of color. And that is super niche, but it's accessible through counseling in a way that I haven't seen in other professions. And then the other side of that, obviously, is like, do your research on prospective programs, what they offer, and whether that truly aligns with some of that introspective work that you maybe done before. Take a look at the faculty and note like their research interest. Does that align? Is that someone you would want to be learning from? Those will be your professors. Financial aid, like Chris mentioned, scholarships, and then if you can, try to look into the culture of the community. I think that's really important too.
Thank you. I also want to officially introduce Dr. Sultan Magruder. We have already introduced you, but it's great for you to join us. Our first question we're starting off with today is, what advice do you have for Black students looking into or applying to graduate programs in counseling and related mental health professions? So to kind of catch you up briefly.
Oh, well, hello, everyone. Please excuse my lateness. What advice do I have? One, make sure you're not going in debt. I think that's a big thing. You know, understanding the profession, while it can be lucrative and in some respect, for the most part, at least it's been my experience working at university counseling centers, that you're not going to be really given a big payday. And we know with Black individuals as well, looking at median household incomes, knowing that, you know, for Black households, it's way lower even among those with, you know, advanced degrees. We have to understand too that, you know, a lot of that money for ourselves are going back into the community, going back into our families. So really knowing that, just make sure you don't get in debt. And there's spaces out there where you can get your scholarships and other things to help you pay for, you know, your education. So make sure you're prioritizing that. I also thinking about my process and choosing graduate school. You know, I studied psychology. That was the thing to do in undergrad, and the next thing to do was to go to grad school. And I think that I sort of like foreclosed on that route without really being able to take a step back and really examine like what my interests were, what my passions were, et cetera, et cetera. And I know in grad school then I did have a reckoning, I think in my second year, where I was like, I don't know if I want to actually do this, you know, anymore. So, you know, I got through that, and obviously I'm still here. I found things, you know, in the profession that I really enjoy, you know, some of the clinical work, but more the training, you know, aspect of it. But I think a lot of that angst and a lot of missed opportunities would have been avoided had I, you know, really stopped to, you know, really think about, you know, where I wanted to go, you know, what I wanted to do. The act of just being able to talk with people and give advice and stuff like that, while that's a helpful, you know, aspect of, you know, the clinical work in psychology, you know, that alone isn't necessarily going to make you, you know, successful. So really, again, just thinking really critically about, you know, this chosen profession and the opportunities out there. Don't go in debt. And that's what I got so far.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I second and third many of those things. I think the thing that I would add to that for Black students who are considering the mental health profession is to really understand the differences in the different helping professions. They have quite different training frameworks. They have quite different sort of practice spaces, and depending on the kind of credential they lead to could have real implications for the kind of work you're able to do in the mental health profession. So, you know, really understanding the difference between social work and counseling and psychology and marriage and family therapy. They have different training programs. They lead to different licenses that give you different access in the mental health profession. So I think it's really important to understand that. When you look at the representation of Black clinicians, particularly in psychology and counseling, we are dwarfed by social work. And I think there's very much a bias towards social work. And I think some of that is really cultural in terms of who and how we've interfaced with mental health clinicians. They tend to be social workers, particularly for Black and Brown communities. And so there's a model for social work where there are fewer models for counselors and psychologists and marriage and family therapists. So as you're thinking about making your own foray into mental health, I would say consider all of the mental health disciplines and really think about where you envision yourself sort of showing up professionally, the way you want to engage your community and the degree to which you want to do that. Like Dr. Magruder, I am a licensed psychologist, but I'm also licensed as a professional counselor. I have a master's degree from a CACREP accredited program and a PhD from a counseling psychology program. So I have a foot in sort of two professional worlds, and that serves me really well. But that may not be the case for all students. So really thinking about, you know, why you might make those decisions about your graduate career is important. I think the other thing that I would add a little differently than Dr. Magruder, I would say go into debt wisely. If you have to go into debt, do so wisely. There are lots of for-profit universities out there that really prey on students of color. They are egregiously expensive, and they often have very little aid to offer students. So I typically discourage students from pursuing them. And they often admit a lot of students. So your chances are, yes, higher to get into one of them, but your debt coming out of them is also higher than choosing a more traditional program. And so really thinking about what the implications of that might be for your long-term career and financial stability is really important. So if you are gonna go into debt, and for many people that's unavoidable, do so wisely. And if you don't have a sense of how to do that, find some mentorship. As a first-gen college student, I had no idea what I was doing. They were like, sign here, fill out this FAFSA, we'll give you some grants, and then you take out these loans. I'm still paying those loans. I will never pay them all back. I'm on, you know, the public service loan forgiveness. So I've got 10 years of payments, and then the rest of it I chalk up to reparations. It is the modern day 40 acres and a mule for me. So I don't plan to pay all of those loans back, but I think it's really important to have a conversation about the ways, particularly for millennials. You know, we were really sold this like, get a college degree, it's the key to unlocking all the doors. And now there's a ton of us who have student loan debt. The job outcomes are not as they told us they would be, you know, so there are all kinds of things to consider there. The last thing I would add, when I talk with lots of Black students at undergraduate levels and post-bac levels, many of them have already prematurely foreclosed on a doctorate. And I am so heartbroken that they have already decided that a doctorate is not for them, because I think there's so much room and certainly need for more of us. All psychologists, five in the nation, 5% of us are African American. So there's a very, very, very small pool of us. And that is the case in every at the doctoral level in every mental health specialty. So the more credentials you have, the fewer of us you see. And so I think it's really important to sort of keep your options open. And I recognize that the PhD process or the doctoral process as an EDD or a PsyD can be quite intimidating, and getting some good mentorship there. I think there's a lot of myths around what the PhD or the doctoral process is like. And you need somebody who can demystify that process a bit for you, who's been through it. So those would be the things I would add.
Thank you. Our next question will be, what implications do microaggressions, racial and societal injustices, racism, and/or intergenerational trauma have on the mental health of Black persons and Black communities? I will read the question again, because it is a large question, and yet an important.
The better question is, what does it have? it impacts all those things. So I'm like, it's probably easier to identify where it isn't impacted than where it is. But
That's a great question. Great.
yeah, it's a lot.
Yep. So to adapt the question very quickly, just talking about the ways in which as a mental health, you have yourself kind of worked with microaggressions, racial and societal injustices, racism, intergenerational trauma in your own counseling with a Black person or within the different diaspora of the Black community.
I mean, racism and race-related stress are really central to the work that I do as a health disparities researcher, and really sort of understanding the ways in which Black communities cope with race-related stress in addition to other kinds of stressors. And certainly trauma becomes a part of that conversation and the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And being really mindful about languaging that as cultural. I think there are lots of ways in which, particularly in the Black community, we talk about things being cultural, and those are actually trauma responses. And I think it's really important to understand and label them as such, as in relation to a coping behavior, to dysfunction, to colonialism, and to enslavement. And I think it's really important not to adopt that as a cultural norm. It is cultural resiliency, absolutely, but it is not normative cultural practice. And so I think the ways in which we even language that can be really liberating for people of color in the counseling space. It's something I do often. And sort of being able to have those conversations to provide language and context for someone's experience, for them to be able to talk about those experiences, to sort of challenge the language that they've adopted around a particular experience, I find to be also very helpful as a relational cultural therapist. In my private practice, 98% of the clients I see identify as Black or African American. So it becomes really central to the work, whatever the work is, whatever the presenting concerns are, to be able to address the role of microaggressions in and out of the workplace and the world around us, to be able to sort of talk about the way in which we experience the world and see the world and understand how the world responds to us in kind, showing up in Black skin at the intersections of race and gender and class and religion and other salient identities for us. And so I think there are, I would say there are fewer spaces where it's not impacted, but I think it's really crucial as mental health professionals that we are equipped and prepared to have those conversations, that we're able and willing to challenge the dominant discourse around those narratives and how they impact people, and to impact interventions that are culturally responsive and informed to address them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna follow up. Thinking about that question, I think of it from my perspective of having worked mainly in community-based mental health centers in DC for the past 4 or 5 years now. And working with mainly people who are familiar with the city, families in wards 7 and 8, working with a lot of youth and their families. And the way I kind of approach the answer to this question is that a lot of looking at how Black families are impacted by a lot of these forces, the ways that are available to maybe alleviate some of that are informed by the same forces. So if I didn't word that correctly, another way I think about it is, I can't remember who said the quote, so I don't want to misattribute it, but you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And so the way I think about that is that, especially in our time now, you'll hear a lot of phrases like, we need counselors, not cops. And in my mind, there's even the recent incident that people may have seen where there was a girl pepper sprayed by police in response to a mental health crisis. And in my mind, with a lot of things I've seen with community-based work, there's not enough separation between mental health fields and these systems of control and punishment, to where even being connected to a mental health professional, you can get looped right back into that system fairly quickly, whether it's child protective services, police, involuntary hospitalization, all those types of things that just put you back in control of these systems that were formed by these same forces that have traumatized you. So I do approach it in a way that the mental health field has just as much of a big job and responsibility to kind of clean ourselves out, decolonize, as police, as the medical profession in general, just everywhere. You know, we have just as much work to do so that people that have been traumatized by these systems aren't being helped by systems that are informed by the same forces.
Thank you.
I feel like there's so much power in validation and acknowledgement that the injury, because that's what it is. That's what the experience of living within a racist system or experiencing events of racism causes injury. It's a harm that causes injury. And so being in a position to be able to validate that that injury and that pain and that harm is real and that it can manifest somatically and manifest psychologically and that all of that is real, I think that is an empowering position to be able to be in, to be able to serve in that manner.
Thank you. Dr. Magruder?
Oh, we all got an answer. Dr. Pittman, all of y'all had really, really good responses. I think the only thing that I would add to this, I'm thinking about the question, was the intergenerational trauma piece, but particularly how that shows up for college students, since that's the population that I'm primarily connected with. But from that, what I'm really seeing is a lot of sort of like top messages, stigma, obviously public stigma, self-stigma about mental health and seeking mental health care, and how in the culture, I guess, Black culture community, that it is more stigmatized. So, you know, the field of psychology has done a lot of harm, you know, to this community throughout the years. And so the cultural mistrust of, you know, the field of psychology is understandable. I get that. And again, this intergenerational trauma caused by racism, microaggressions, X, Y, and Z, that has caused like lasting harm and trauma, you know, related, you know, symptoms to the parents of the students that I'm seeing, the aunts, the uncles, X, Y, and Z of the students that I'm seeing. And so with that, they sort of internalize these messages that, you know, one should not, again, you know, seek out mental health supports, and that, you know, racism is, it's sort of normalized, and that, you know, it's a common occurrence and you just push through and you get through it. And any sort of like higher level of care is not necessarily justified or needed. So again, I think this intergenerational trauma can sort of perpetuate this sort of like toxic masculinity, you know, particularly for males, you know, that I'm seeing, and that we know that racism, race-based trauma can, you know, impact an individual's emotional expression. And we already know culturally, again, culturally defined broadly, you know, in the Black community, emotional expression typically looks like anger or really nothing else. You don't show sadness, you don't show hurt, you don't show guilt. So, you know, with that, we know that, you know, in dealing with trauma, the emotional aspect of the work is really important. And so for the students that I'm seeing, males in particular, one, it's already hard to attract them into our system. But two, when they get in there, it's very difficult, you know, for them to engage in the process because of, again, a lot of the work is dealing with emotions, and because of the norms that have been sort of instilled in them from, you know, family members that have, you know, experienced intergenerational trauma, that becomes a barrier or a hindrance. So I think that's the piece that's really sort of like notable in the work that I've been seeing, particularly with like males, is that, you know, emotional expression and how that, you know, connects with intergenerational trauma.
I would just add, I would thank you, Dr. Magruder, for sort of bringing in the gender piece. I think I also see that in our training programs, and I think it's critically important to understand the ways in which whiteness as an ideology, as a power structure, has shaped mental health training. And I see it adversely impacting Black males in training programs all the time, the ways in which they are policed academically, for tone, for writing style, for using vernacular English that is culturally normative, the ways in which they emote or don't emote or connect to the emotion of a client. I have seen time and time again, white identified supervisors give them low marks on evaluations to grade their work disparately because they don't approximate whiteness well enough. And so the ways in which they get socialized out of their Black maleness in counselor education, I think is another layer that is critically important to pay attention to, not just as clients, but how we socialize Black men as trainees, and many of them end up getting counseled out of programs because they don't reflect the standard of what counselors should be able to do. And on the other side of that, they run the risk of being tokenized when they do. And so it's a real issue that we have to, as training programs, have to be able to reckon with our roles in that.
Thank you. That connects perfectly to our next question. So given that the counseling and related professions are grounded in whiteness, colonialism, white supremacy, can you talk a little bit about your own liberatory, Black-centered, and anti-racist counseling, and talk about your work and the importance of that?
So I would answer that in terms of, I think what just comes to mind for me first is the ways in that I've seen those things manifest in my professional work, which actually surprisingly is not always coming from a white person. White supremacy can be projected by Black people, which is quite disturbing when you see it. So I think particularly in community-based mental health spaces where a lot of times I feel like my day is taken up, it can be very scattered sometimes. You don't feel the same it's not the same environment that you feel you were trained in, where it's kind of, you're in a room across from one person and doing your therapy session. It can be very scattered, like I said. So I think the way that I have seen myself have to approach, kind of anti-racism or just countering white supremacy in my professional life is really countering certain perspectives that people have as it comes up, even if it's other professionals. Something that just comes to my mind right now is I've been in a room with a Black nurse practitioner. She wasn't a psychiatrist, and telling a parent that the Adderall they're prescribing the child doesn't have any side effects. That's a lie, And it was really, you could tell that the motive was, hey, the only solution here is to shove pills down your kid's throat. So to me, it's kind of like, okay, I'm working with a Black family. I think for me, it's just very important to not go down those pathways so quickly or so forcefully, and be able to see the child as a child. It plays into the adultification of Black children too, where it's just like, we need to look at this from a holistic perspective, and that can be very challenging when there's a professional who has more degrees than you and may hold them over you. So you try to make suggestion, it gets pushed back. So yeah, I've found most of my, I guess what you could call anti-racist approach not happening in the counseling session, but sort of around that, and just what an organization's approach is. I've worked at a place where we would have consultations with the CEO, and her outlook on all of our cases was very bleak. The children had no future, essentially. And someone would make a suggestion of like, hey, what's this kid's hobbies? Do they like to dance? Do they play a sport? And it was like, oh, this is actually a person, not just we're looking at these symptoms and their history and saying that they're doomed, they're not going to go to college, all these types of things. So that's really been a big had to become a passion of mine, of just pushing back against those, where Black people, we just finished Black History Month. There's Black futures. Like we do go forward and still exist. So just being able to highlight that has been really important for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think for me, I don't actually see, so I'm at Penn State University and predominantly white, campus, and the students, as far as like Black students, I don't actually have a lot on my caseload, that I'm seeing. And again, I think we've been trying to really figure out student body as a whole, but particularly for students of color and Black students in particular, really trying to figure out like help-seeking behaviors and what some of the issues are, particularly, for our campus. So that's a whole nother story. But in sort of like thinking about like anti-racist work, given that I'm primarily seeing white students, I'm making sure I'm centering sort of like my Blackness in the work, if that makes sense. So what that means is I'm making sure that I'm communicating in some way that there is a difference, that I identify as a Black male, and that I have unique experiences, not only in the world, but particularly here at Penn State and State College. And I think that's helpful to keep race, I guess, to like center race and understand that's just an important thing to consider. And as a white person, that's an important thing to consider when you're bringing things into the work with me. And hopefully, I've had, interesting conversations with clients that were sort of like learning opportunities for them, such that they were able to take that and apply that, into their everyday lives. So again, being able to center, myself, in the work as a Black male, calling attention to that, I think is important for deconstructing some of these racist ideologies and practices. I'm also the coordinator of diversity, equity, inclusion, at my center. So with that, I, have the opportunity to, provide, trainings, to offer different programming that centers on, Black issues, race-related stuff. I think it's been really helpful. Double-edged sword, obviously, Black Lives Matter protests and the COVID pandemic, particularly how it's, adversely impacting, the Black community. But being able to provide that programming and stuff like that I think it's been helpful, for me to aid in sort of like anti-racist work, even though I'm not able to, directly work with, the individual Black communities that in the degree that I want, but being able to find, other opportunities in my work to actualize, I guess, that passion.
Thank you.
As a master's student, still being in training, I kind of think about anti-racist work as service to my community, or the community that I would like to be working with, and knowing what those needs are. So that means literally just being geographically aware of the Black people that are in my area, and knowing that Black people are incredibly diverse. And I specifically kind of want to bring attention to intersectional invisibility in Black communities. And these are obviously our marginalized Black people that are often rendered invisible, even within the Black community. So Black Muslim women, like myself, other non-Christian Black people who don't have English as a primary language, and several other identities exist there. I just feel like we have an obligation as Black counselors to be cognizant of these identities, and to get out there and to serve these communities, or at least to have a pulse on what's happening across these incredibly diverse Black communities. And so just to plug, the Mayberg Center at GW is having a lunch and learn, I think they're calling it, on March 17th on negotiating a Black Jewish identity. So that is a great event to attend, just to kind of help sharpen maybe your own cognizance of Black identity and its diversity.
Thank you. Would you be willing to either state that again or type it in the box so that anyone who's interested can make sure that they find access to that?
Yes.
Thanks, Shane. Dr. Pittman.
I guess the only thing I would add with regard to my own work is making sure that that work is multi-pronged. That I am simultaneously working on changing systems and people locally and nationally and internationally. I think you can't do all of the things, but you can impact systems and individuals. And I think all too often DEI work gets reduced to increasing the number of people in a particular place. And I'm really clear that I won't just invite more Black and Brown people into hostile spaces to just cause injury to more people, that we really have to change those systems so that they are welcoming safe spaces for Black and Brown people to learn and grow and heal. And so I think often the work is focused on just changing individual behavior and attitudes without regard to the influence that systems and the ways that systems operate and the policies around systems and the status quos that systems create shape people more than individual behaviors do. And so, just wanting to be anti-racist is certainly not enough. And knowing Black people is not enough. Marrying Black people, having children with Black people is not enough to erase your own bias, your own ingestion of white supremacy and the ways in which that might show up covertly and overtly. So I try to make that work multi-pronged, which can be exhausting, particularly living through sociopolitical contexts like we are. But I think it's also necessary. And as a Black woman with multiple advanced degrees, it also feels like a responsibility to do so, that I have a great deal of privilege attached to the level of education that I have and the tables that allows me to sit at in the rooms that gives me access to. And so when I'm in those spaces, ensuring that I am challenging the dialogue that's happening in those spaces around Black and Brown kiddos who are being misdiagnosed oftentimes, more often than not, that are students who are being discussed in ways that are pejorative and damning, to challenge white colleagues when the conversation shifts from race to some other marginalized identity that they can more comfortably participate in the conversation around. So it's making and taking up space and making people uncomfortable, quite frankly. I think it's something I do rather well. And it's important, right? It's important work. But I'm also really clear that if I don't do that work, that there's a cost not only to me, but to other folks who come behind me. And I don't want to sleep with that at night, but I also recognize that I've chosen this as my sphere of influence to sort of reshape what this work does look like and who does this work. So.
Thank you. Connected, how can the counseling profession and mental health counseling programs or even mental health programs better meet the needs of Black students and Black communities?
As a current student, I like to see a little bit more focus on, I guess, greater integration on Black contributions to counseling, specifically because I am in the counseling program. So just going beyond the acknowledgement that our profession, like many others, is rooted in whiteness. I like to see Blackness integrated. So Black thought, whether that's through reading or assigned research, I just would like to see a greater sense of urgency in the incorporation of Black voices, which have, no doubt have been there the entire time.
Thank you.
I have a lot of opinions about this, which I'm sure surprises no one. I think there are many things that we need to do. And I think first and foremost, recognizing what structural barriers exist for Black and Brown students to train in our programs, to choose us. I think often we think we choose students, and I think that that's particularly for Black and Brown students, that's a misnomer. They choose us, and particularly those of us in predominantly white institutions, we should be grateful that they are subjecting themselves to the abuses that they will undoubtedly encounter in our programs, regardless of how good our programs are. Microaggressions and macroaggressions are insidious, and they show up all the time. Everything from misnaming or misgendering a student, which seems small and benign to the offender, to the receiver. It's not a small infraction. I have been on faculty in the graduate school for 7 years, and I still have colleagues who misspell my name. It is not a small infraction to work with someone closely for 7 years, and they can't figure out how to spell your name when it appears in your email address. And so, sure, I could chalk that up to a typo, but you've typing my name for 7 years, it should auto-populate the correct spelling of my name. It should not be recognized in your email as a misspelled word anymore, as your names are not recognized as typos in my emails, right? So I think there are those, even like at that sort of very day-to-day level, things that we need to be able to reckon with. I think owning and being accountable for the harms that the mental health profession has caused to Black and Brown communities, Black communities in particular. Mental health is a part of the medical field. We cannot distance ourselves from it. And so sort of the medical mistrust that has been discussed previously is not a Black community issue. It is a white community issue. It is a medical community issue. And so the responsibility is not on Black folks to deal with the medical mistrust that they have, but for the system to change the impacts that the ways in which care is provided, the ways in which diagnoses happen, and the ways that they differentially privilege and oppress communities is really important. Tuition, I think we spend a lot of time talking about wanting diverse students on our campus, but recognizing that Black students are more likely to be first-generation students than other racial groups, particularly their white counterparts, and the ways in which 450 years of enslavement and Jim Crow and Black codes have really disenfranchised students from being able to pay $1,800 credit hour tuition. It's a real problem. It's a structural barrier problem at the Board of Trustees level, who sets the GW tuition, which is also where most universities' tuition structures are set. And find me a Board of Trustees who doesn't have a person on it who makes a 6-figure salary. So if the top of the ladder is setting tuition for the entire system, and they're using an equality model to do that, that everybody in the getting graduate education pays the same tuition, that is a structural barrier that the university can address and is choosing not to. And the university has to recognize that we have made the decision not to address this structural barrier, and this will have implications for what the diversity of our student body looks like. So I think that's one thing. I think certainly to Shani's point is the ways in which our curriculums are diversified, what our faculties look like. We're in the District of Columbia. We are a graduate school of education. The majority of doctorates awarded to Black folks in this country are in education, and we can literally count the number of Black faculty in the graduate school. There are only 3 Black faculty with tenure in the graduate school at GW, and I am one of them, and the other 2 are male. That is a problem. We can't support all of the Black students in the graduate school, and we have brilliant Black faculty who are not in tenure accruing positions, and that's a shame. Whether they want them or not, but they're brilliant, and we should be doing everything we can to keep them and to keep their brilliance and to honor that. And I think that's important. So I think that the things that we as academics, and I count myself in that as part of that system, certainly working to dismantle it, but I'm not absolved of the responsibility that comes with being a part of the system. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Dr. Pittman.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add to that. Dr. Pittman, I appreciate you mentioning the first gen student. I too am a first gen student, and understanding the sort of barriers that come along with that identity, navigating grad school, not knowing, you know, what this entails, what the resources are, the questions that I should be asking, and not having the support of the predominantly white, you know, training staff, professors in my program, not having their support to at least ask that question of what are you needing, right? Or even preemptively understanding like this is the incoming cohort. It was myself, at least for racial ethnic minorities in my program, counseling psychology, there were 8 of us. And so there was actually 2 Black males, me and another one, and a Latinx, a male who identified as Latinx, and the cultural taxation that occurred was pretty problematic. So I know that was originally more coined for faculty of color in higher ed, and basically what that is they're being called to take on all the diversity related issues of the department of the university, right? So obviously the taxation that occurs with that increase with like workload, and much of that is invisible too. But that being placed on graduate students to speak up in the multicultural classes about your experience as the 1 or 2 Black people, having, you know, graduate assistantships placed on you for teaching the diversity course, right? For primarily majority white students. And we know what evaluations and stuff, how that ensues in those classes for those particular faculty members or you know, staff. So that cultural taxation, intersecting with identity as a first gen student, I think the sensitivity to that can be improved, I guess, among, you know, the training of grad students. So that's what I would add to that.
Thank you.
The only thing I would really add, I think everybody has made wonderful points, is just the difference between education as a right and education as a privilege. It currently functions as a privilege where it's kind of approached, hey, you paid to come here, you kind of get what's here. But if we see education as a right, then we'll know that if our educational attainment is being violated, those are our rights being violated. And that's kind of it's where we need to get to, so that yeah, higher education just isn't structured as something that you need to be rich for in order to get through.
Thank you.
And then, like you said, that you should be grateful then of the opportunities. This is a gauntlet. This is what everybody experiences. You'll get through it. Well, there's disparities in who actually persists and actually graduates from these programs. And it's typically, you know, white students. So anyway.
I mean, one of the things I often share with my students of color, well, there are 2 things. One is that graduate school is not a democracy. Everybody does not have equal say or equal vote. And when it comes down to it, your faculty are usually going to win. And so, you know, part of it is like thinking about how do you bring your issues to your faculty in ways that you can both be heard and get your needs met, and allowing, hopefully you have an advisor who behind the scenes at a peer level can sort of address some of the sort of underlying issues that are driving those issues. And so part of it is being able to mentor students to sort of move through their programs as unscathed as possible. And that's important to me. I think the other piece of that is around building their own supports. being intentional about knowing them, about asking about them and checking in on them, but encouraging them to build networks outside of their departments. Because they will need them. They will need to have other people to talk to collaborate with, to vent to get input from. And unfortunately, sometimes there are just so few that it's really hard to do that. And it's unfortunately something we don't even do well in the graduate school, as small of a community as we are, as connecting our students across programs and departments, our students of color in particular. But it's really, really vital, I think, to the emotional and psychological well-being of students to have thriving networks outside of their program.
Is there anything else that panel would like to add before we move on to our last question? No? Okay. So the last question for today will be, what Black-centered and liberatory books, media outlets, or resources have you been exposed to or fell in love with that you might recommend to new emerging mental health professionals?
So I came prepared for this question. I have books next to me right now. So 2 books specifically that really opened my mind and changed my approach. So the way I came across these books was really wanting to deconstruct the stereotypes that we come across a lot in this work with Black families. Particularly, this is the ones you hear all the time. Where are the fathers, and why does this woman have so many children? So I really wanted like a historical analysis breakdown of those issues, because just from our pop culture, you're not going to get anything. There's not many outlets to really find a well thought out answer to that. So I ended up finding 2 books, one of which is Fathering from the Margins. So that is, it's kind of a study that this woman did focused in, I believe it's in Harlem, and it really just explores all the different facets that go into why a father may not be with the family, why that may not necessarily be a bad thing. It's more complex than that. But the other book is called Ensuring Inequality. And I really enjoyed this one. The subtitle is The Structural Transformation of the African American Family. And so it traces from slavery, of course, of just how all these different systems have impacted the Black family to just change in different ways, from how slavery split up families, but even just currently how the policies we have in place promote or don't promote certain things, or are attempting to promote things that they shouldn't. One of the things that I remember from it that really just stuck in my head was how TANF, that program, which is Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, if you go on their website, one of the stated goals of TANF is to promote marriage, which doesn't really make sense to me. You know, you're providing money for people in need. How is that promoting marriage? Why do you even care if they're married? Like, they just meet the need. It doesn't matter the format of their family. So those 2 books in particular just really helped me to approach the things that I would see from a educated perspective, because you would encounter those things. One quote that I'll probably never forget, I had a mom tell me, if I knew having 10 kids would be this hard, I would have stopped sooner. And it's something that kind of sticks as like, okay, well, what was her lived experience that really got her to this point? And so just helping myself to understand how trauma can play a role, how patriarchy and wanting to, how having a man in your life connects you to economic needs that really shouldn't be set up that way. So yeah, it's just very complex things that these books helped me to wrap my mind around.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say for me, quickly, I'm a fan of watching Black intellectuals or Black people inhabit white spaces and take out their kneecaps, basically, intellectually speaking, right? So thinking of like Bakari Sanders or Bakari Sellers, Simone Sanders, Cornel West, Michael Eric Dyson. I just love listening to them. And I would say when I'm particularly upset about something that's occurred, that's gained media traction, We all heard about the Karens of the world. When I'm angry, I generally shift to Roland Martin Unfiltered because he is very unapologetically Black, along with his cast, and he's very intelligent. So being able to watch that free on YouTube, Roland Martin Unfiltered, I would encourage that. But what I've been trying to do more recently, I feel like I'm a young professional. I am a young professional. I'm only 30. But being able to just get more experience from elders, I think that's something that had been missing from undergrad to basically now. It wasn't necessarily encouraged by the sort of like white establishment within my programs. So being able to go back to the roots, talk to elders in the field, even outside of the field of psychology, to really understand and just soak in information about their lived experiences, how they've navigated, primarily white spaces, oppressive systems, and being able to apply a little bit, to my work. So I think that one-on-one contact has been something I've been trying to do a little bit more of.
Thank you.
I really enjoy the Therapy for Black Girls podcast. I think it's just a great podcast to just learn more about mental health in general, if that's something that you're interested in, and then specifically for Black people and Black women. I also want to plug the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, which is a conference that happens annually. Their website, they also have a lot of resources on trauma, self-care, and intersectional invisibility, which I talked a little bit about earlier, and I can put a link to that in the chat.
Thank you.
I absolutely second Therapy for Black Girls podcast. It's really fantastic, and I love Dr. Joy. She was my supervisor as a doc student, and she's equally fantastic in person. I love to read. Reading brings me a great deal of joy. I wasn't prepared for this question, so I'm like thinking, I'll start. Anything by Bell Hooks. One of my absolute favorites of hers is Teaching to Transgress, and which, to Chris's point, is really about understanding education as a right. Teaching Community is another Bell Hooks book that's fantastic. Currently, I'm reading Black People Invented Everything, which was recently published, which I'm really enjoying. My Grandmother's Hands by Risa Manikheim is beautiful and powerful, talking about racialized trauma. David Archer just released a book earlier this year called Anti-Racist Psychotherapy that I've only read a couple of chapters in, but I think is really practical and accessible. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So at this time, we have some minutes left for question and answers for our panel today. So if you could just go ahead and unmute, introduce yourself, and ask the question that you might have for our panelists today.
So let me go ahead and get started, Dr. Peters, and I will say, can you hear me? First and foremost, thank you to the panelists. Thank you for your bravery. Thank you for your vulnerability. I really appreciated hearing everything today. I want to say that this was a student and alumni led event. So Shani and Chris, thank you for bringing this to my attention and helping in the organization of this. My question is about self-help. It's been a really difficult year for lots of us, but particularly those within the Black community, not just in America, but around the world. What type of techniques do you use to take care of yourself? And are those informed by your training, considering you're exposing yourself to so much other people's trauma along the way?
Yeah, as someone who's brand new to this, definitely newer than the rest of the panelists, I am going into it knowing that I need to take care of myself. So I'm trying to be proactive about that. So I'm doing a lot of meditation. I'm doing a lot of yoga. I'm trying to eat as best I can. I am minding my business. I am drinking water and just doing all of the things that I have that I have access to just make myself well. I really do feel like that when I'm well, I can be the best counselor that I can be for the clients that I have right now. And it's something that I do want to continue. So I'm looking forward to what the rest of the panelists have to say.
Yeah, I would just say knowing my place, knowing what space to inhabit, where I can actually make a mark, and knowing that there's other people who are more expert in a lot of things than me. So not allowing them, but moving over so that they can do what they need to do. Taking a step back, I know for me, it was hard to engage with. I'm a media political buff, so I like just reading and watching, what's happening and understanding over the past year and a half or so. Like, it's just been traumatic, like just this compounding trauma. So I've had to sort of like pull back in certain ways and being telling myself, being compassionate with myself and saying that's okay, right? I don't have to continually be engaged with this. So now, recently, I'm starting to run for local office. So we know with Black people in particular, in the face of race-based stress, one of the things that's helpful in sort of promoting resiliency is activism, being able to connect, with others, do things in the community. So for me, this was literally like over the past 2 weeks, like I was like committing, I'm going to do this. I got some petitions signed and just submitted those. So running for, a local office. So that's been my sort of approach to this basically year and a half, staying my lane, knowing my limits, but then re-engaging in some way.
I would say my experience, of course, it's been a roller coaster over the past year or so, but I think what I really came to over the time is that, well, for one, I think the sort of pop culture approach to self-care, self-help is very surface level and doesn't really serve anybody. Um, and what I've realized over this time is like a lot of the things that we're having to cope with, we shouldn't. So if we didn't have fear of, not being able to pay rent, if things were just put in place how they ideally should be, a lot of these things would be off the table, but I know it's kind of a perfect world. But I would say for myself, I've just really had to adjust how I'm separating my work and personal life. It was much easier before leaving the office, where now the office is my dining room table. And really focusing in. Something I started doing more that wasn't really for self-help, but I've just been exploring more of my family history, which I've known most of before, but just really tracking things in detail. And I found that the more I learn, the more empowered I feel. And the more empowered I feel, the less I feel that I have to fight these things that aren't my fight. It's not my fight to figure out what happened at the Capitol building, or there's other people that should have done their job there. It's not my job to dismantle a lot of these systems that weren't of my creation. And so just focusing on empowering myself and just being well in that way, rather than always having to battle something.
I would say yes to much of that, including minding my Black business, which is where I try to start, but really setting boundaries. I think particularly in academia, it is not boundary friendly. Work is everywhere all the time. There's always something to do. I sort of started setting a window for when I check my email, and if it's outside that window, it just has to wait. And being really unapologetic about that. Unfortunately, the work that we do is not often life or death. So, not responding to something immediately and giving myself grace in that has been really necessary. As my career evolves, my self-care needs also evolve, and sort of being mindful of that and attending to that and expecting that. What else? Again, I like to read and making sure that I'm reading things for pleasure, not just for work. But participating in discussions like this also, fill my cup. So, saying yes to more of these opportunities and no to things that don't fill my cup in the same way, or saying yes to fewer of those things. But I would say most of the ways that I take care of myself and self-help are not congruent with my training program. I think much of the self-help and the self-care we talk about in training programs is, as Chris mentioned, more of the surface level stuff: walking, meditating, yoga, massages, those things. And those things are lovely and wonderful. But for me, the things that really feel restorative are connecting with my friends and family and sharing meals together, cooking together, eating together, dance and music, so figuring out ways to do those even if by myself. So.
Thank you to each of the panelists. Do we have a second question? Okay. Well, then today we'll be closing with a brief call to action. For our panelists today, if you could make a call to action for the counseling profession, counseling and mental health training programs, for the people who are here today, what would that kind of call to action be?
I would say within the profession, I would, to put it simply, just listen and don't lie is how I would word it. Really listening intentionally to communities, not as a lip service, but really wanting to put them at the forefront so that our services actually meet their needs. And yeah, don't lie about what we're offering. Like was said earlier, the mistrust in our profession is legit in many ways. So yeah, just be honest, and for us within the field, really work to change things so that it can better reflect a structure that is healing to people.
Thank you.
How could an otherwise sane person operate in an insane society? That's really what I would hope that the profession, but also, at least as I think about my organization, work organization, that they really take note of, and that we need to stop pathologizing the individual meaning individual couple or family, and really start looking to dismantling, as Dr. Pittman and others have shared today, dismantling systems. So I think that's a call to action that I put to my organization, and I just hope that sort of generalizes to the broader spectrum of the field.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Sure. I was going to share that I'm really inspired by a quote by Dr. King where he says, "I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be." And I feel like that is a quote that kind of carries me, and something that I hope that the counseling profession can continue to strive to be who they ought to be, and that we collectively as a community can be who we ought to be as well. For me, that means being well individually, and hopefully that will transfer in the work that I do. And so I guess my call to action in that would be to find something that makes you well and do it as often as possible, whether that's on the path to becoming a professional mental health counselor, or being in this field, or just in your personal life.
Thank you.
My call to action would be different depending on the group. And I recognize that there are multiple groups represented here. So I would say that my call to action would be for those here who are white identified and wish to be allies to the Black community. And that would be to do your work. As I often say, if you are white identified and living in this country, you are racist unless you are actively working to be anti-racist. because racism is essentially the thread that stitches the stripes of our flag together. It is in everything and everywhere, and you have been socialized in it. You are fish and it is water. You don't even know you're wet. And so get about the business of doing the work. You know, awareness is a prerequisite to doing better, but it is not a precursor to doing better. So, you know, just knowing that racism exists, reading a book or 5 is not enough. And that's not to say it's not a place to start. But if you are not carving out time in your schedule to do this work, to be introspective about your role in perpetuating systems of oppression in whatever your sphere of influence is, you're probably not doing enough. And I know that's hard to hear because we're all exhausted, we're all tired. But I think as Shani noted, that we can't be our best selves until you get about the business of creating systems that can embrace our best selves. And certainly those systems currently aren't deserving of our best selves. And so the more folks who are in those systems, pushing those systems to be better, both at the system level and at the people level, I think that is where room is created for more Black and brown folks to show up more authentically and more fully.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Wright as well as each of the panelists today for sharing your time, energy, experiences, and narrative. And I am grateful and give it a round of applause. And that is all I have for today.
Thank you, Dr. Peters, for moderating and helping out with Chi Iota Sigma. Thank you. We appreciate that. And thank you to our counseling department at GSEHD for a great event. Thank you.
Thank you. I know some